Hello, hello. We're here in the dingy room. I got my coffee. And today, for discussion, we're going to be talking about James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. Now, James Baldwin was a writer born in the 1920s, passed away in the 1980s. He's an American writer from Harlem, United States, so New York, predominantly African American part of New York. And this is the first work of his that I've read. I was tangentially aware of James Baldwin as being part of the civil rights movement. However, while he was in many ways an activist, he was much more of an intellectual, much more of a writer, much more of a debater in many sense. He has a very famous debate with William F. Buckley in regards to civil rights and segregation. However, he wasn't as much while he was a public intellectual, he wasn't as much he's not studied, I would say, as much in school as one of these civil rights leaders like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, because he didn't really take up too much of a public profile in demonstrations. He did do many demonstrations, however, but we generally learn much more about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X during this time period. Now, while that was my impression of Baldwin, his story, Go Tell It on the Mountain, is much more than simply a civil rights story. It's much more than a story just about the realities of racism. While that is incredibly important in this narrative, there's something much more existential and universal that's happening in this novel. Now, the novel is just under 300 pages, and it's semi-autobiographical. So the more we learn about Baldwin, the more we can map on elements of this story onto his life and see the parallels. So the story, just the title of the story itself, Go Tell It on the Mountain, it evokes very much a biblical feeling. I think of the scenes of the prophets and the figures within the Bible in which they receive revelations on the mountains. Especially Moses, this really very much, it recalls the scene of Moses on the mountain. Now, what does this story concern itself with? So first we're going to give a brief summary of the story, and then we'll talk about actually what is happening in this story, what I believe Baldwin is confronting us with. So the story follows essentially the life of John Grimes on his 14th birthday, the day of his 14th birthday. And this is the day that he's going to be saved. He is essentially going to commit himself to religion and a life as a preacher. Now, Grimes's family, the patriarch of the family is Gabriel Grimes. That's his father. It's not his biological father, though. And Grimes, it's not completely sure whether Grimes is aware of this. I think it's subtly alluded that John Grimes, the son, knows that he's not his biological father. There's a tension between them. They seem complete opposites. Gabriel obviously does know that John is not his son. Now, Gabriel is a deacon at the church, this African American church. I believe it's a Pentecostal church. So they're in Harlem. And he's a very prominent figure within this church. However, he's a very oppressive, patriarchal figure as well. And he very much tries to have his whole family revolve around this church, and the family does. Now, John Grimes's mother and Gabriel's wife, Elizabeth, also become a part of this drama. They also have two other children, a daughter and another son. However, these children are Gabriel's biological children. One of them, the other son, so John Grimes's half brother, Roy, he's also an opposite to Grimes, John Grimes himself. Whereas John Grimes, our protagonist, is very introspective and introverted. Roy is very much impulsive, and he has an antipathy towards the church, it seems. And this, Gabriel, obviously, Gabriel wanting his son, especially his biological son Roy, to continue his legacy within the church. This creates a distress for Gabriel himself, a psychic distress, because Gabriel has invested much more of his life, you can tell, towards Roy. Roy is his favorite, whereas John Grimes is very much neglected. And there's a tension between Gabriel and John Grimes because John Grimes seems to be destined for the life of a preacher, and everyone says that around him. Now, the structure of this novel, it follows the first quarter follows the present, in which we see the realities of life in Harlem. Now, while Harlem did not enact Jim Crow laws, segregationist laws, there is a tension in which African American characters, do feel like there are certain things they cannot do, certain places they cannot be in. Some characters in a flashback, when they're describing the North, they're describing how being in museums, it does feel like a place in which they don't exactly belong in. There are certain shops where John Grimes feels like he's not as actually comfortable in being. So even regardless of escaping the South, there are still these realities of a sort of self-imposed segregation. Perhaps not self-imposed, but it's definitely subtly enforced by society, perhaps institutionalized in a very subtle way. Now, this is the present, and during the present, Roy, John's brother, he gets in a fight with some other children, some other boys, and he gets very badly injured. And this creates, it seems to create a culmination of, we have a climax very early on in which this family, the Grimes family, is to come to terms with the fact that Roy, the son, is very likely actually is following in his father's footsteps of Gabriel, because Gabriel himself had a very impulsive and by many ways not as how could we say clean, early life. And so the family has to come to terms with their relationship with religion, with Christianity, and what it means for African Americans. So that's the present. Now, a good portion of the narrative follows the prayers of the saints. And this happens during the evening service right after Roy's injury. And these are 3 prayers. And these prayers are essentially flashbacks. And they tell a lot about racism, religion, other oppressive elements that have a pervasive and almost a generational effect on the characters. So the first prayer is the prayer of Florence, who is Gabriel's sister. Then there's Gabriel's prayer, and then there's Elizabeth's prayer, Elizabeth being Gabriel's wife. And these prayers are happening all while Elisha, who is a young preacher, slightly older than John Grimes, who is in some ways a mentor to John Grimes, but they're also subtly rivals. Elisha is speaking in tongues. So this is a Pentecostal church, I believe. So a church in which they still believe in the coming down, the new prophets emerging, that people have the ability to speak the Lord's word and continue on new revelations. So that's a significant part of the novel, are these flashbacks. And towards the end, we see John's conversion, his final conversion, and that he will choose this path of being a preacher. Now, what we see throughout the narrative, the bigger picture, are actually the world as prison. These prisons that we construct within the world. So these are my opinions, my interpretations of the readings. However, we see continuous prisons being erected that oppress their characters. Continuous oppressive forces. So whether it's the reality of your gender, which Florence and Elizabeth being women, they are essentially oppressed by not just religion and racism, but those things that interact with each other and create a sort of gendered oppression, a household oppression for them. Florence and Gabriel being siblings, there is a sibling rivalry that happens between them. Florence has to sacrifice a lot early on in her life, in her childhood. For Gabriel, she's having to sacrifice these things because there's much more of a favoritism towards the men, the boys, and Gabriel in their early youth, in their childhood. Even though Gabriel, as I alluded to earlier, had a very wild childhood, was very lustful, was very impulsive, and got in a lot of trouble, and was very much a good for nothing. So Florence essentially escapes the South, tries to escape these bonds of household oppression, and goes to the North. And there, while she manages to escape racism and in many ways her family, she tries to create her own new family. However, these shackles of household oppression, of gendered oppression, and the deep-set internalized racism still follow her in the North. Now, Gabriel's story and his prison seems to be a prison of this intermingling of him struggling to come to terms with his desires, his lust, as well as um, the grandiose and hereditary aspect that he imposes on Christianity. So for Gabriel, heredity, his sons, his progeny, continuing on this oppressive, very patriarchal world of God, this world of Christianity, it's incredibly important for him. However, he's, as I mentioned, grappling too much with his impulses, and he tries to, while as he gets older and he manages to essentially sublimate these desires, he subliments them rather into a form of oppression and using Christianity in this oppressive, sexist way. Now Elizabeth, John's mother, also is confined by this sense of gendered and household oppression herself. However, she sees, while she initially neglects the church, she eventually ends up marrying Gabriel, even though she had what seemed like a true love in a different character earlier on. However, this character himself, even though they were in the north, he experienced a sense of institutional racism in which he was accused for a crime in which he didn't commit, and he had to commit some time in prison. This is the one time that prison is actually a place here. However, these prisons that continue to follow the characters, this is the theme in Baldwin's story. And this makes our story supremely existential. In seeing the world as a prison and these prisons that we construct and that seem to follow us, is there a truth to our prisons? Are they our designs? And is there a solace in our prisons? Must we throw ourselves into our prisons and create a sort of compromise with these prisons? And how do these prisons make us? There's talk about the price that John is going to be facing, and this price, it costs his life. He's aware of it. However, in a similar regard, the price that the devil takes on your life, on your soul, also costs your life. So how can you discern between the devil and God if both of them lay a claim on your life? Similar in regards to the prisons that John himself is trying to escape. They're not just the prisons of racism that he is confronted with, even in the north, but his sexuality. John is very much drawn to men. We get that impression early on in the story, and this is a tension with him. So in order to succeed for him, he seems to have to engage in a symbiotic relationship with his prison. We have to sort of interact with our prisons and make a compromise with them and fling ourselves to something that perhaps may be another prison, but is essentially the same. So rather than, let's say, give in to lust, you have to give in to this oppressive Christianity, as Gabriel does. And I would say this story is very much a quiet one. It's one that's told quietly, even though the prose can be quite ornate, very beautiful, and Baldwin touches with many heavy internal feelings. He does this quite well, and especially the prayers portion of the narrative is quite well done. I could pick up many quotes from this novel that are quite beautiful, and I could almost pick them up anywhere, and they seem to exemplify this theme that I'm talking about. So early on in the narrative, this is when Roy, just before I think Roy gets injured, where Roy and John Grimes were kind of setting ourselves in the scene. And Elizabeth, Roy's mother and John's mother, is scolding Roy for his impulsive actions. And then she says, "But it'll be too late then. It'll be too late when you come to be." Her voice had changed. For a moment, her eyes met John's eyes, and John was frightened. He felt that her words, after the strange fashion God sometimes chose to speak to men, were dictated by heaven and were meant for him. He was 14. Was it too late? So John does feel drawn to religion. He's drawn to it. He feels this coming up within him. This is going to be his path. This is how he's going to choose to cope within our world. Now, whether the message is overtly anti-religious, or there is a sort of solace, a sort of path to enlightenment within our prisons, that is what Baldwin is asking us. And it's very easy to see this as being an anti-religious text, in which religion and racism are kind of commingling and creating these oppressive structures. However, can we escape within these structures by falling so deep within them, by making a compromise with them? Or will that perpetuate this cycle, just as Gabriel is doing? That's a question that Baldwin poses for us. Now, that was Go Tell It on a Mountain by James Baldwin. Lovely story. Very beautiful story. A story that it took me a while at first to get grounded into it. However, the prayers, I feel, the prayer section is very much the strongest part of the narrative by far. You really do get an insight into the structures that permeate through the lives of various characters, and how these structures affect the descendants as well. There's always a remnant of this trauma that's felt within later people, later generations. Now, hope you enjoyed this. Take care.